So last week, when the news came out that Red Hat was essentially going closed source, I made a video and then I realized that maybe it's not as simple as the open source community is making it seem. So just to get to the gist of it, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL, is no longer going to be available for free to the public. You can still purchase a license and get the source code, but you cannot modify and distribute it. So essentially, it has become closed source. This does not violate the general public license. However, it in the open source community, people expect a Linux distribution or any open source project to be available for free for people. Red Hat as a company is one of the most important companies when it comes to open source, and specifically for Linux. So historically, there were two main versions of RHEL. One was what Red Hat offered to its paying customers, but the code was also available for people to just download and use. For paying customers, they would provide the software, but also support for the software. If something did go wrong, you could contact Red Hat and they'll help you solve it. But since it was available for free for everyone to use, people and other companies used that source code, modified it, or basically just rebranded it and made it available to the public. Any upgrades, any software patches, security patches that Red Hat Enterprise Linux got, CentOS and other derivatives of RHEL also got for free. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with open source, this might seem like a stupid idea. Like, why would you do that? But see, when companies do this, at least in the open source arena, everyone benefits because of the old philosophy of open source. The values of open source community that sustains the business. One, of course, the code needs to be available for everyone to see. And then there is freedom to use, modify, and distribute. Those are the pillars of open source. If a community likes what a company is doing, people will devote their resources, time, and skill to that project. If they don't like what a company is doing or what a developer is doing, they are going to abandon it. Now, before, when Red Hat was an independent company, Red Hat was still a for-profit company. It was not a non-profit company. It was for-profit. However, at its core, it is, I want to say it is, but at least at that time, it really was an open source company. Its entire business was based on open source. Red Hat takes free open source software like Linux, like the Linux kernel and GNU software, and builds on top of it, and then sells it to paying customers. Also, as a sign of general good faith in the open source community, at least that's what I think, they released it to the public for free. Red Hat also benefits from this. If people in the community like what you're doing, people are going to contribute their time and effort towards your project. Now, one might argue that Red Hat is using free and open source software like the Linux kernel and GNU software, and maybe others as well, then it is only right for Red Hat to make RHEL, the enterprise Linux, available to the public. Now, IBM is not an open source company. Now, I'm not saying that the problem is coming from IBM, but when IBM bought Red Hat, 2 years later, Red Hat cut off development for CentOS, which was the free version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, right? It still exists, but not in its original form. It was not a one-to-one drop-in replacement for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. At that time, I urged people, if they could, to move away from RHEL and go to Ubuntu and or Debian. If they do not want to pay for the licensing fees. If a company wanted to pay for the licensing fees, they were already paying for it, then there's no change. Nothing is different. On the other hand, the reason I recommended either Debian or Ubuntu, but mostly Ubuntu, was because Canonical is what Red Hat used to be, and Ubuntu is what RHEL used to be. Canonical provides paid support, but it also provides the operating system for free for everyone to use, which I think is the right way to do open source. So RHEL, which is the biggest name when it comes to Linux, in enterprise Linux specifically. I mean, I built my entire business with open source software, relying on open source software. Now, the way I made money with open source was take something that's open source and then sell the services to install and customize and maintain that piece of software. That's how I made money. The software was installed, the customization was in the hands of the customer. They were free to do whatever they want with it. They can hire someone else to come and upgrade it or add more updates to it without my help, because the code is available to them. It's not closed. When it comes to Linux and open source in general, things are a little different because you are using someone else's code and then selling it, which is, again, not only is it allowed, people and companies do that all the time. There is an expectation of reciprocity, right? Now, when it comes to Linux and open source in general, there are two main users. One is the general user that just download the software and use it, which is, again, it's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, it's encouraged. People in the open source community encourage other people to use it, even if you're not ever going to contribute or never going to donate or never going to do anything. If you're just going to use it, that's fine. That's great. The more, the merrier. The second type of user are contributors. Now, there are different levels of contributors. Now, this is not something that is set in stone or which is like a qualification of what kind of a contributor you are. This is just something that I have come up with to make it easier to discuss. Now, level 1 contributors are people who make tutorials and talk about open source software and answer questions in forums, help other people in the community out. Those are, I would say, are level 1. Level 2 are contributors that provide feedback and test the software. Level 3 are developers and testers. Those people who actually deal with the actual code itself. Now, in level 3, there are two types of contributors. One type are the developers and testers that are funded by companies. Either their own company that is developing that software, or it could be employees from other companies. Because in open source community in general, companies would actually pay their employees to contribute to other companies' open source projects. This is because, again, everyone benefits from it. Take, for example, when Microsoft switched from their own proprietary code for Edge to Chromium base, which Chromium is actually owned by Google. And Microsoft is now not only using it, but also contributing to the code. The open source community is a finicky and very fragile ecosystem. If people don't like what you're doing, they will abandon it. And there's a lot of outrage when things happen which people do not agree to. Now the question is, who does this really affect? Now in the short run, businesses that are using an older version of CentOS or that needs upgrading, or they're using free derivatives of RHEL like Alma Linux or Rocky Linux. You can still use Alma Linux and Rocky Linux, but this is not going to be a one-to-one drop-in replacement for RHEL. It becomes tricky. You can use Rocky Linux and Alma Linux, but the risk, especially if your business depends on RHEL software, the risk is great because there's no certainty as to whether the software or any software that is supposed to work with RHEL is definitely going to work with Rocky or Alma or any other free derivatives of the old RHEL system. Now, as for companies that are already using RHEL, already paying for the subscription, they don't need to worry about it because nothing changes for them unless they are using the paid subscription and then redistributing that software. That is something that is not going to be possible moving forward. If you or your company is affected by this change, then what do you do? What are your options? The first one, and the simplest one, is to just pay the fees and move on. Because, I mean, in business, time is money, and businesses are supposed to be making money. I don't use RHEL. My personal servers and my business servers are all using Debian or Ubuntu, so it doesn't affect me as much. If you are heavily invested in Red Hat, in the Red Hat world, it's really not worth switching to Debian or Ubuntu or any other variation of Linux. If, however, you are not heavily dependent on RHEL, but you are still using one of those free derivatives of RHEL like Rocky Linux or Alma Linux, then you have a choice. Either pay the fees and again move on with your life, or you can switch to either Debian or Ubuntu, which, if I were to narrow it down to just one, I would say Ubuntu is the number one alternative to RHEL. Second, if you are in a transition phase, meaning either there are servers that need to be updated or there is a new project that your company is starting, and also the project or the new servers do not depend heavily on RHEL and other software which is very specific to RHEL. In that case, I would say move to Ubuntu or move to Debian. I would say Ubuntu because, again, for businesses, I think it's important to have support because, again, time is money. You cannot be paying your employees to fix problems when you could just pay a subscription fee or a licensing fee and then have the freedom or ability to call the company, call the people who know more than you would ever know in trying to solve whatever issues that come up. I moved clients away from RHEL when IBM bought Red Hat because again, it goes back to the fundamental core values of the company. IBM is not an open source company. I'm not saying IBM is evil. Corporations do what corporations do. Red Hat is not a non-profit company. It never was. However, at its core, it was an open source company. Now, in the short run, Red Hat is actually going to gain customers because, one, they're not going to be losing customers because people who are already paying the fees, they won't suddenly decide not to pay fees because nothing changes for them. There are companies that use use the free derivatives of RHEL. Now, a lot of companies might just decide it's easier to just pay the fees and move on, which again, if you're dependent on RHEL system, RHEL software in general, I would say just pay the fees and move on. Now, there will be companies that don't use RHEL, are not paying customers of RHEL, who will decide that they don't want to stick to the ecosystem that Red Hat provides and move to Ubuntu or Debian. In that case, Red Hat is not really losing customers because they were not paying customers in the first place. In the short run, Red Hat definitely is going to gain more customers. But in the long run, I think everyone loses. Now, let's go back to the open source community again. It's a very finicky community, very fragile ecosystem as well. If the community likes what the company is doing, they will devote time, resources, their effort for free to that project. If people in the community don't like what a developer or what a company is doing, they will abandon that company. They will abandon the projects. Now, I'm not talking about the corporate world, the enterprise world. I'm talking about the open source community, the contributors. Now, Red Hat has contributed a lot towards the Linux kernel, CentOS, GNOME, Fedora, Xorg, Systemd, Cockpit, Network Manager. I mean, this list goes on and on. So I don't think Red Hat as a company should be demonized. However, again, I'm going back to the core values or the core principles of a company. IBM is not an open source company. Red Hat is an open source company, was an open source company. IBM owns Red Hat. Now, as I mentioned, the open source community is a very sort of fragile ecosystem as well. It depends on companies contributing to the open source project, but it also depends on the community providing feedback and also the code itself. Now, judging by the trend that is happening, first the end of CentOS, now this, the closing of RHEL code. This begs the question, what about other projects? What is going to happen to Fedora, GNOME, CentOS, Stream? Will Red Hat decide to stop contributing to these open source projects? So in the long run, the trend is a bit concerning. But we'll see. So that's all for today. If you like this video, if you found it interesting, please like the video and share it with anyone who might be interested in Linux and open source and Red Hat in general. Please do subscribe because I plan to make these kinds of videos, not necessarily just on Linux and open source, but other things that I find interesting. Peace.